Thank you all for stopping by, and welcome to the first webinar of our spring series entitled Chicago Climate Action Plan, Creating and Implementing a Community Climate Plan. These webinars are an initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university led by OSU Extension, Ohio Sea Grant, Bird Polar Research Center, and 6 other OSU departments to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lakes residents. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Tom McKone. Tom is from the Civic Consulting Alliance, where he helped create the implementation plan for the Chicago Climate Action Plan, and is currently working with Chicago's Chief Sustainability Officer to accelerate sustainability and climate action in Chicago. Under Tom's leadership, the Civic Consulting Alliance provided over $15 million in pro bono support from 20 firms to the Chicago Climate Plan, and received Boeing's 2011 Game Changer Award in recognition of these efforts. We're delighted to have Tom here today to discuss the creation of the Chicago Plan. But before we do that, a few logistical issues as we get started. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, about 12:40, Heather Elmer from the Ohio Coastal Training Program and Old Woman Creek NEAR will conduct a question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature located on your right-hand side of your screen with the drop down to Heather's name, and Heather will collect and pose your questions out to Tom at the end of his presentation. We have a great group of people on the webinar, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, and nonprofit groups from the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep those questions coming throughout the presentation. We should have a great Q&A session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It will help keep us continuing to give you better webinars. Also, a reminder, if you are taking this webinar for Ohio Continuing Professional Development Credit, there will be a separate small survey to complete your registration. See the chat box for details. So now, without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Tom McKone from the Civic Consulting Alliance, who will present Chicago Climate Action Plan, Creating and Implementing a Community Climate Plan. Tom, I am going to unmute you. You are now unmuted. And
thank you, Jill.
I am going to hand over the presenter ball to you. And you should be good to go.
Great. Thank you, Jill, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of the information about what we've experienced in Chicago, and also to hear from others about their experiences and the opportunities and the challenges they might be facing, and what we can all sort of learn from each other about creating action in this sector. So without further ado, I'm going to present probably for about 30-35 minutes, and I expect that then we'll have time after that to do question and answer. So just a bit about our organization, since I'm not representing the city of Chicago, but the Civic Consulting Alliance. We're an institution in Chicago whose mission is to provide pro bono professional services to the public sector in Chicago. Our main client is the city of Chicago. We work in several program areas to advance Chicago and make Chicago an even greater city. And the area that I work in is the environment program area, and what we do is we find partners from the private sector to work with us and the city on the city's most pressing environmental issues and then issues in other sectors. We've been around for 25 years, but we were founded by an institution that was 160 years old, the Commercial Club of Chicago, whose claim to fame was publishing the Burnham Plan. And as you can see from this slide, we figure out enduring and high-impact ways to make our city more globally competitive. And we're doing that in a large part through the climate action plan with our environmental work in Chicago. So first of all, I want to talk about the genesis of the Chicago Climate Action Plan, then what was done to create it, and then what we're doing to implement the Climate Action Plan, and then some updates on where we are with the Climate Action Plan. So the Climate Action Plan was really envisioned in around 2007. Chicago signed the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Protection Agreement, which agreed to meet certain targets for climate change, and this was sort of as the result of an international push for addressing climate change, but a lack of federal action. The city of Chicago worked with the city of Seattle and then numerous other cities to sign the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Protection Agreement, and then through that, the city then decided to put together a climate action plan to help meet those particular goals. This is the climate action plan. The goals are a 25% reduction in carbon emissions from 1990 levels by 2020, and then an 80% reduction from 1990 levels by 2050. In addition to this mitigation aspect, there is also the component about preparing for climate change. And so part of the climate action plan is not only the mitigation aspect, but then preparing for the changes that we anticipate and know that are and will occur in Chicago. And really what this represents is a vision for Chicago. And I think one of the things that sticks with me is that it's easier to turn a vision into reality than it is to turn reality into a vision. And this document served as a great vision piece for Chicago, and then a lot of the work since the piece has been put out is how do we turn that vision into reality. Just a note about where emissions come from in Chicago. 70% of them come from buildings and the energy used in those buildings. 21% come from transportation, and another 9% from waste or industrial processes. At the region, if we look at the region, so when we did an emissions inventory, we also did one for the 6 counties that include and surround Chicago. Once you expand to that sector, you see a lot more coming from the transportation area. We've always seen cities as the solutions, both in terms of committing to and reducing carbon emissions, but then also as locations where people can lead a low carbon lifestyle. And this is an example that is in the climate action plan in terms of on the left hand side you have the quote unquote traditional view of cities which are as high carbon emitters. So if you do an emissions inventory, cities tend to seem to produce a lot of emissions. But if you really look at that on a per capita basis, people have relatively low emissions themselves when they live in cities. So we see cities as a solution, not only because they themselves can reduce absolute emissions, but that people and businesses that locate in cities can really more fully participate in sort of the low carbon opportunities. So how do we create the climate action plan? It was a 15-month process of the creation, and then another 7 months to actually get the document up and running and out there. 3 phases. The first phase was the assessment. So what are the carbon emissions? What are the climate impacts that are going to be a part of that? The next set was a lot of engagement, so working with the community groups and the business groups and the other organizations who are interested in helping to move the city forward in this particular area, and will be key partners for helping to implement the climate action plan. And then implementation, which continues to this day. And actually, implementation occurred before the actual plan was published. Here's the assessment phase, impacts and adaptation. So using researchers from University of Illinois, Texas Tech, and others, what are going to be the impacts in Chicago and what are going to be the cost of those climate impacts, which really helps make the case for change. So what's going to happen in Chicago and what's going to be the cost of that. The other thing was the mitigation analysis. So what are the baseline emissions? What do we think the business as usual case is going to be? And then, what are the options that are out there, both locally and sort of nationally and internationally, that are going to help reduce those emissions that we can work into our climate plan? And then, what's the actual potential for reducing those particular emissions? And then, how does that apply to the specific actions that can reduce those emissions? All of this is available on the website through a great document that one of the foundations helped fund for the creation of this. It's called the Climate Change in Chicago. It's a research and planning tool. You can find it on the website through the plans and reports, but it goes through the entire sort of process for creating the climate action plan in Chicago, which is a great resource for doing this. Here's an example agenda from one of the planning sessions. I mentioned that there were a number of planning sessions that were with external groups. This was a task force meeting. There was a task force that helped to monitor both the assessment piece of it and then recommend what was included in the climate action plan. And this is just thought it would be useful to share some of the artifacts from that process. This one was hosted at the MacArthur Foundation, a local foundation in Chicago. You can see on the agenda looking at the climate impacts, looking at the mitigation strategies, and then breaking out into different groups to look at the various aspects of either the financing or the communications or the other parts of creating the plan. The planning and engagement process, really looking at who are the partners that we want to engage, how are we going to vet what's in the plan, so making sure that it's vetted both internally within the city and then externally with the groups that are going to participate and really support the climate action plan, and then assessing existing and future initiatives and using external groups to help do that. Here's the example of some of the 50 meetings that were held with 500 local leaders. Some of these were smaller groups, some of these were larger groups. Obviously, some people participated more heavily than others. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Center for Neighborhood Technology, who was a great partner in producing the mitigation report, and also helping on the engagement piece of it. Here's what the task force looked like. So the task force was really in charge with developing the recommendations for the climate action plan and helping to guide it. So on the left-hand side, you can see all the members of the task force. This can be found in the climate action plan report. It's a good mix of public sector, private sector, and then nonprofit representation. And then in addition to that main steering committee on the left-hand side, there were the 6 committees on the right-hand side, various, looking at finance, research, communications, and these all had additional members. So some members that were pulled from the steering committee, and then additional members that were members only of those particular committees. Here again is the result in terms of the goal. You saw the slide when we started. Here are the specifics of the strategies that are in the climate action plan. First of all, looking at energy efficiency, that's number 1. The second is clean and renewable energy sources. The third is improved transportation options. The fourth is reducing waste and industrial pollution, and you can see the specific goals within each of them. These are the reduction goals by 2020. Items 1 through 4 are the mitigation actions. So how are we reducing the carbon emissions? The 5th strategy is adaptation. How are we preparing for change? And in particular, looking at 3 specific impacts. One is the change to our infrastructure. The second is how that climate change is going to affect people. And the third is how is it going to affect ecosystems. I would say that one of the things that was nice about the climate action plan is that not only do you have the 4 mitigation strategies with the specific goals attached to each of them, if you look in the climate plan, each of these 4 strategies then have 26 actions that are associated with them, and each of those actions has a specific target in terms of what needs to be done, how many houses need to be retrofit, and then the carbon savings associated with that. So not only do we get a reduction goal with these larger strategies, but then you also get the specific actions and the targets associated with those, which has been really useful in Chicago as we look to measure progress, and also as a guidepost in terms of what things do we need to sort of evaluate or reevaluate. So it's been a really useful piece to have here. As we've gone into the implementation piece of it, because it sort of grounds us and then gives us something to work off of as we move forward. The climate action plans have received numerous awards and recognition. One thing I will point out on this page is the foundation support. A lot of both local and national foundations were very helpful in supporting the development of the climate action plan. So some of the costs that you saw on the initial page, some of those were covered by foundations, and these are a list of some of the foundations, some of which are local, some of which are national, to help support this work. Most of these foundations continue to have a strong climate focus, and so they continue to help on the implementation piece as well. What have we done within implementing the climate action plan? First of all, there's lots of different pieces to implementation. You've got going from the strategy level into getting into the nitty-gritty of what are we actually doing in the short term to implement is an issue that we addressed on implementation once the plan was out there. Looking at the other aspects of it, so how are we collaborating with others? What are the other impacts that we could point to that are critical for the community? What is the research that we're doing on how climate relates to the different communities that are in Chicago? The Field Museum in Chicago actually did a lot of community-based research to learn and develop how do communities relate to the climate action, so that the city could more effectively communicate and engage with those communities, and it was different across the various communities of Chicago. The other thing that I'll point out that was useful, that the Climate Action Plan spurred, that was useful and probably something that wasn't anticipated ahead of time, was the additional support that other community partners would bring to highlighting not only the Climate Action Plan, but just the climate change in the sector in general. The Field Museum had an exhibit in 2009 about climate change. There was sort of a science-based exhibit about climate change, but then there was a Chicago Climate Action Plan piece of that exhibit. There was a Cool Globes exhibit in Chicago that highlighted the impacts and importance of addressing climate change. So there have been a lot of things that the Climate Action Plan has helped spur, just by showing that this is of interest and important to the city, and then it allows others to think about how they could best contribute to that. An implementation, it's a lot of getting together working groups. We ended up having a lot of folks on the city staff who were interested in the topic area. They may or may not have helped to develop the plan itself, but once the city had a climate action plan, they were really willing to work and collaborate with the various departments and agencies that wanted to share in the pieces of the climate action plan. So you had a lot of really sort of latent interest across city staff and the government agencies in Chicago about addressing this. The Climate Action Plan, again, provided a great vision, and then working with those staff, we were able to turn that vision into the actual tangible actions that they could go and do within their organizations. So, for instance, there's a body that regulates the taxi industry in Chicago. They were not a part of developing the original Climate Action Plan. Once it was developed, they said, how can we play a part in achieving the goals of the Climate Action Plan? And just a few months ago, Chicago passed new legislation that encourages more hybrid taxis, more fuel-efficient taxis, by increasing the lease rate that vehicle owners can achieve by leasing these vehicles out to the drivers. And then the drivers capture savings based on the fuel savings that are a part of that. And it's that sort of thinking that having a climate action plan and then working with the interested staff helped to develop within the various departments and agencies, and so then they could think about how they could best apply that to their work. And then the taxi regulation agency says, okay, great, what we can do is we can think about how do we work in incentives for more fuel-efficient taxis in Chicago, and then they can create a legislation like was passed 3 or 4 months ago. So those are the sorts of things that we started to experience within the implementation piece of it. Here's an example of what we call the lead by example work that we did, working with each department and agency. So we had 20 of them that we were working with. Examples would be Chicago Public Schools, or the Park District, or the Transit Authority, or you might have the Department of Streets and Sanitation, or the Water Department, other agencies like that. Created a work plan. So what's your initiative? What are the milestones with those initiatives? Put a little star on the ones that were the top 5 within their work plans, and then had a support process by working both with the staff who were implementing that initiative, but then also with the executives so that they could call forward the success and show others sort of how they're incorporating the climate action plan into their work. Really helped bring people into the tent to participate in the implementation and help people identify things that may not have occurred when the planning process was underway. This is an example from the Department of Aviation looking to conduct an energy efficiency audit at O'Hare, and then looking for potential sustainable initiatives at O'Hare and Midway, which has now the airport department has a green aviation manual, and they're looking at things like stormwater and other areas. And so this process just helped really align with a lot of the other work that they were doing and helped sort of spur them to think about additional initiatives as well. Chicago Public Schools initiated an energy shared savings program where the schools that participate and achieve a 5% savings in energy consumption, get a portion of those financial savings refunded back to the school. And this is from the 2010-2011 school year. In the most recent school year, they have 150 schools participating. It turns out that they're sharing back a portion of the savings. So the district is saving several $1 million and then refunding back to the schools somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million from the Energy Shared Savings Program. In addition, here's some other specific projects that were called forward in terms of what Chicago has done in helping achieving the goals of the Climate Action Plan. One is renovating the Daly Center. That was a traditional sort of energy efficiency retrofit. The other was on the O'Hare Modernization Program, where the work that was being done out there, they were actually able to remediate the soil on site, which eliminated a lot of truck trips, and we were able to calculate sort of how much fuel was saved as a result of that, how much carbon dioxide was a result of those savings as well. I can take you through each of the strategies and highlight some of the specific initiatives within each of them. So now we're starting to talk about progress. Within energy efficient buildings, I'll highlight the Green Office Challenge. Green Office Challenge was initiated as a voluntary program for large commercial buildings downtown Chicago to participate in. There are 150 participants, and you can see the results here in terms of their energy savings. ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, has taken on the program, and they have a national sponsor now, Office Depot. And so this is a program that's underway with a number of other cities who have, again, a voluntary program for their businesses to help achieve not only energy efficiency, but sustainability goals, which align with the sustainability plans and the climate action plans of the cities that they work in. Clean and renewable energy sources. A lot of the agencies actually are doing a lot of procurement of renewable energy. It's definitely more affordable now, but even before the prices dropped to make it really affordable to do renewable energy procurements, Chicago Public Schools was buying 20% of their energy from renewable sources. The Park District 25%, the city itself 20%. So you've got a strong basis of organizations that are purchasing renewable energy, and obviously this aligns to the goals in the Climate Action Plan. Transportation options, a lot of this is about providing more options to individuals so that they can reduce single occupancy vehicle trips. And you can see on the left-hand side here, it's also all about different options like bicycles and hybrid buses and a new bus rapid transit and electric vehicles. Actually, I'm going to go back to this one too and highlight. This is on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of one of the advertisements, which was on the public transit system, so on the city's buses and trains, that highlighted what and how public transit contributes to this one specifically was about carbon emissions, but they were broadly about sustainability. And you can see here it's got the logo of the agency. It's also got the climate action plan on there, and it's sort of highlighting to the riders and to the customers sort of here's the environmental benefits of something like public transportation. And this is a good example of how the climate action plan can be integrated with the sustainability efforts of a lot of the other organizations in the city. Reduce waste and industrial pollution. Chicago was helped here because of a really instructive waste diversion study or waste assessment. So what we discovered is that there's really a lot of construction and demolition debris in the waste stream, and a lot of this is getting diverted. Thanks in part to things that the city does with its own internal construction projects, and thanks also to some of the ordinance requirements of recycling of construction and demolition debris. And then highlighting really that paper is a really large part of the waste stream, and so a specific focus on reducing paper specifically. And then adaptation. As I mentioned before, 3 components to adaptation: the people, the built environment, and then ecosystems. Within that, there's a lot of emphasis on stormwater management. Chicago has a lot of green alleys, so these are permeable surfaces within the alleys that help divert water from the sewer system. Also on greening through trees and through green roofs as well, which both help with the urban heat island effect and with the stormwater impacts as well. In terms of the climate impacts, increased precipitation, severe precipitation events, and increased heat were two of the more significant impacts that were identified for Chicago. And these investments are meant to help to prepare for those eventual changes. In terms of updating the Climate Action Plan and what we've been doing going forward, so the plan was published in September of 2008. Since then, obviously, you've seen some of the implementation pieces that I mentioned before. There have been some other things that we've done to help sort of look at how do we take the Climate Action Plan forward. Mentioned in the plan was the fact that it's meant to be a dynamic document to help achieve the carbon emission goals that were laid out at the start of the document. So really, we went through a continuous improvement process where you take the plan, you go through the work planning and the implementation piece, which I mentioned previously. What are the initiatives and how are you supporting this? Collect the data on the progress there, so what's successful, what's not successful. Look at where the gaps are in terms of where you are and aren't achieving success, and what may or may not have even been in the original plan that might show up as something that's going to be particularly helpful in achieving those goals and should be a focus area. Create those additions and then syndicate the changes, and then go through this process to update the plan and the actions in the plan to make sure that you're achieving the overall goals, but being flexible enough where you're not necessarily married to the actions that you identified in 2007, 2008, given the fact that things are going to change over time. The City of Chicago released a dashboard of progress that covered the first 2 years of progress, and this highlights progress in terms of the mitigation that was achieved. So in the center of the document, you see the achieved pieces by each of the strategies, and then at the bottom, there's a bar that says, we tallied up all the actions in terms of where we are with the progress. We've hit 1.2 of the 15.1 that we've identified as of 2009. So certainly there's still a long ways to go, but if we're just taking a bottoms-up approach, adding up strategy by strategy, did we do what was in the strategy, or how much did we do that was in the strategy? What are the carbon emissions associated with that? This is what we came out with, and this is what we released publicly to highlight both the achievements, but then also some of the highlights as well, so people could understand what some of the changes were within what some of the specific things that were being done within these areas. And then we recently completed another emissions inventory. The Climate Action Plan was based off of emissions inventories that were done in the year 2000 and the year 2005. We just completed an emissions inventory for the year 2010. So this is a top-down process where you take in all the carbon emission sources, which again were primarily buildings and transportation, sum it up and say how many carbon emissions are being produced in Chicago. This is an update to that overall trend that I showed at the start of the plan, and you can see that from the 2005 level, which was 36.2 million metric tons, we've dropped in 2010 to 33.5 million metric tons, and this puts us on a trajectory to have reduced by 2020 about 5.1 million metric tons over the business as usual case, which means we still have about 10 million metric tons of reductions that are needed to go. So this is 3 years into the process that goes out to 2020. Contained within this are additional changes in the methodology. So that's why the dots are a bit of a different color, because obviously the methodology that we were able to use in 2011 is different than the methodologies that were available in 2007. And so inherent in that 33.5 is a change in how some of the sectors were looked at. Usually this meant that we would have increased the emissions in terms of if we'd used the same calculation in 2005. So the reduction on a percentage basis, if we look at an apples to apples piece, is probably a little bit larger than what this graph indicates. But these are the dot points that indicate the top-down progress that we've done by using emissions inventories. Here here is a summary of all that. So this is on the left-hand side, we have what the emissions inventory was in 2005. On the far right-hand side, we have what it is in 2010. These are the same numbers that you saw on the last slide. And then we start to get into the causes of why did it go up or down. Interestingly enough, one of the major contributors was a change in the electricity mix. So there's a fair amount of more renewables that are in the system. There's also been a switch to more natural gas. And so that's dropped the electricity emissions factor. And then you see the various changes, some in methodology and some in demand, that have occurred within the other sectors as well. In addition, recently we've been focused on what are the economic impacts of the Climate Action Plan. When the Climate Action Plan was originally created, it was created to focus on the carbon emissions and the mitigation potential. A project that we completed over the summer, and again, the information is available on that same website, chicagoclimateaction.org, under the reports section. In terms of what do the green jobs look like in Chicago, there was information that was released by Brookings last summer that had a lot of green jobs data, and we were able to grab that data specifically for Chicago, show what Chicago looked like relative to the rest of the country, both the city itself and then our larger region, and then project out, so where do we think this sector is heading over time, and what do we think we could really do to maximize the jobs potential within this. And this is just one piece of information from that report, but it highlights sort of the focus that we wanted to bring to the Climate Action Plan, which is on the economic development aspects of it. In looking at the information, the green job sector was actually growing both nationally and in Chicago when a lot of the other sectors were shrinking. And then when we compared Chicago to some of the peer cities and then also some of the more advanced cities, we saw there's really an opportunity to increase the growth in quote-unquote green jobs in Chicago by raising sort of our growth rate from 2% up to something that's a little bit more aggressive, and some specific strategies for doing that. I'll highlight here, this is a partnership. That was the first thing that I mentioned about our organization, is that we try and bring folks from the private sector to help the city and other public sector entities in Chicago advance critical areas. This is an example. I'm sure not everybody is on this slide in terms of the folks who have contributed to the Climate Action Plan. A lot of the private sector firms you see on here, like Bain or like BCG or A.T. Kearney, provided pro bono resources to work on the plan. The foundations obviously were ones that provided funding support, and there are others then that partnered, like the state's Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, to provide funding for specific initiatives. On an ongoing basis, we have a regular group that gets together that functions a lot like a board for the Climate Action Plan, and this is a list of the people that are on that group. So the task force was created to create the plan, and then what we call the Green Ribbon Committee was created to help with the implementation of the plan, and they both serve as an advisor and oversight group for the city and the work that the city does, basically by saying, have you focused on this? What are the results? They've been a big driver on making sure that there's a quantitative analysis of the progress that we're making in the Climate Action Plan, and then they themselves can help bring resources or help advance particular issues in Chicago. And you see here, it's mostly a set of sort of private sector or civic leaders in Chicago. They get together every other month, and then sometimes in breakout groups as well to address specific areas. But they can really both provide momentum and then serve as a good checkpoint for the city to make sure that the city is still focusing on the implementation and on achieving sort of the sustainability objectives for Chicago. And then here you have where you can follow the Climate Action Plan. I mentioned the website a few times. It's actually got a great set of resources in terms of the reports that are there, and then information about the Climate Action Plan via Facebook and Twitter. The City of Chicago also recently launched a sustainability website as well, and that's cityofchicago.org/sustainability. And that, I believe, is the end of my presentation, so I can turn it back to you, Jill.
Okay, great. Heather Elmer is now on, and she's actually going to, we've gotten some really great questions, so Heather is going to take over moderating the questions. Heather, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Great. Thanks, Tom, for that wonderful presentation. And we do, as Jill mentioned, have about a dozen really good questions here for you. And the first one that I'll relay is this process iterative enough to involve the review of new data, information, and impacts, especially considering the nature of climate change as a continuously evolving phenomenon? So what kind of, I think you spoke a little bit about your measuring progress, and where is there a place where you can incorporate new information?
Yeah, so hold on one second. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the question is about how iterative is the process and how well can you take in new information. It's the emphasis on measurement has been really helpful for helping us think about taking on new information and changes that are occurring in the sector. So we can take all 26 actions and basically say, how are we progressing within each of these actions? And what else is out there that's occurring that haven't been a part of our actions? So one example is the city's own infrastructure. If you look in the Climate Action Plan, all the energy efficiency measures are about buildings, and there's nothing about the city's traffic signals or street lights that are contained within any of the actions. And so as we went through the process, we noticed that there was actually a lot of interest in helping do things like install more energy efficient streetlights and traffic signals, and that those could produce significant emissions reductions for the city. And so that's something that through the continuous improvement process that we worked in as, right now it's a draft action or change that's a part of the Climate Action Plan, but certainly something that we're counting towards those overall results. I would also say that the other thing that was done as we moved to implementation is that the plan itself does not has good high-level goals within each of the actions, but we saw a need within each strategy to go into a more specific implementation strategy. So for energy efficiency, for clean and renewable energy, and for transportation, we actually worked with partners to create the real short-term implementation strategy for each of those. They got into more of the specifics around what are the specific things you're going to do and programs you're going to put in place to help achieve these goals that are laid out in the Climate Action Plan. So that was some additional work that we saw as necessary just from taking a more specific look within each of the strategies.
Great, thank you. The next question was, how did you determine different levels or types of vulnerability within neighborhoods? And there was a related question regarding whether or not a vulnerability assessment was completed for the adaptation component of the plan.
So, vulnerability, let me just clarify vulnerability. Do you mean vulnerability to the oncoming climate impacts?
I think that's what the intent of the question was, yeah.
Okay, so how are we preparing for change? Let me take 1 minute on that, and then I also have another person here, Olivia McKone, who's with the Global Philanthropy Partnership, who's one of the partners that was listed there, who's worked on adaptation specifically, who could maybe elaborate a little bit on something that I might have left off. So the city has a couple of tools to look at climate impacts. One of them is an urban heat island map, and that has been really useful for looking at sort of what are the specific areas and neighborhoods where there's just an increased amount of heat, and so it's basically the heat map of the city where you say, okay, this is where we think urban heat island is going to be a problem, and so this is where we want to prioritize things potentially like tree plantings or other sorts of investments around the urban heat island. In terms of storms and preparation for storms, there's been work with the Office of Emergency Management and Communications about being more prepared for severe events, and then also the city in general has preparations for both extreme heat and extreme cold as well that have gotten an increased focus because of the climate action work. But Olivia, is there anything I'm missing?
Yeah, the other thing that I just wanted to elaborate on a little bit goes back to the point Tom was making. in how the plan was developed is having it very much based in studies and science and research. And so before the plan was launched in 2008, part of that process was engaging with Oliver Wyman and Montgomery Watson Harza to look at impacts specifically, the climate impact specifically, and what they mean on some of the city's assets. So Oliver Wyman worked with the city, consisting with interviews to many of the key city departments and agencies, and said, what sort of assets are you concerned with once we've already done this research and looking what climate impacts will look like? And then Montgomery Watson Harza helped the city to prioritize the actions that we needed to take with regard to the climate impacts based on timing and when it looked like those impacts were going to happen in Chicago, and then severity and sort of what level of impact that might mean to the specific impacts in the city. So some of those examples would be the physical assets that belong to the Chicago Transit Authority are rails. If we're going to see more extreme heat, that might be something that's happening on a longer time scale, but that would be something that would be a high priority for the city because we want to make sure that we're keeping people safe in the city. So that research is also available, as Tom mentioned, on the Chicago Climate Action Plan website. So if you want more, see the website and look at our climate impacts, our assessment there.
Great, thank you. Another question that came through was, do you have any advice to smaller communities where there may not be leadership from the top, particularly on how to fund such an effort as the Climate Action Plan? And there was a follow-up question in regard to the total cost of the planning and implementation process thus far.
Yeah, so there's different ways. So let me just mention the types of resources that were brought to the development of the Climate Action Plan. The first resource was really city staff time. So it's often sort of overlooked, but you need to have a coalition of folks who can focus and work on this, and that's not free, obviously. In some sense, it's already paid for. The other side was foundations. There are a lot of foundations, and there are a lot of foundations in the Great Lakes area that are interested in addressing climate change in particular. They tend to be, as you said, I think they're probably a little bit more focused on some of the larger cities. But I do think that they are interested in sort of helping out smaller cities as well. There's a foundation locally, the Grand Victoria Foundation, who's been really who's committed to making sure that there's a strong regional component, and that means sort of engaging all of the other local communities. And there's 270 of them that surround Chicago, and a number of them have signed on to the mayor's climate protection agreement, and a number of them have also created climate action plans as well. Advice in terms of if you don't have the executive support, where is there support? So are there support from other community groups? Community groups also donated time, and they could be an important ally in helping to find resources as well. I mentioned Center for Neighborhood Technology locally. The Delta Institute locally has been good as well. ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, has a sort of a standard climate inventory and action planning tool, which is a good place to start as you're interested in this. I think finding if you could do bottoms up and generate bottoms up support, I think that's a good way to start getting attention to the benefits beyond climate that this can bring to your. So for Chicago, a number of the benefits come with sort of the city's brand as a green city, and people get the fact that being a green city is really good in a number of ways beyond just the environmental impact. So that's a good way to package it. The other thing that we did, you can see I have the Green Ribbon Committee slide up here. It may or may not be feasible to have a similar sort of group of external folks who are interested in this, but they often have good connections as well to the higher levels at the city. What we did is we worked with a group like this to invite the mayor and invite a couple other folks just to have a breakfast of sort of civic leaders on the importance of addressing climate change and what they can do and what the city can do. And that as an event really helped sort of elevate it and show that it doesn't have to be the city alone, and it shouldn't be the city alone that's doing this, but there are other folks who can help support doing this. And even as you look with within your own city organization, you would probably see that there's a number of staff, like I said, that have latent interest, who would be willing to participate and help to develop something like this from the ground up.
Wonderful. Our next question is actually from a 7th grade class in Dayton, Ohio. And the question is, was public education involved in any capacity in the planning of Chicago's action plan? Was there any effort put into educating a new generation of Chicago citizens through public education? And were public educators included on any of the committees? And you talked about a variety. This was an early question. You talked about the Field Museum's research and the climate exhibit and some of your energy sustainability initiatives in the schools. So if you could just say a little bit more about integration and approach to public education, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's there's 650 schools in Chicago. So Chicago has a large public education system, 400,000 students that go through the system. And each school can sort of decide how they want to engage in sustainability. And you have a lot of schools who might look at the climate action plan and say, well, waste, that's something we'd really like to involve our school more in recycling and reducing waste and thinking about how do we become a zero-waste school. And so they pick up on that thread and they integrate that at their schools. Others of them might say energy. We're really interested in, for instance, the Energy Shared Savings Program that was developed at Chicago Public Schools. And so we want to help our school save energy and then get some of that savings back to our school to do whatever program. It's free to the school to figure out what to do with those savings. But they say they might really want to engage on energy. There are a lot of groups that are out there that help the students in Chicago engage more on or work more on climate change and environment and sustainability. The Chicago Public Schools, the system was involved in helping to create the climate action plan itself, and then it's left to the schools to work with other organizations to figure out what's the right fit for them and for their community in helping to work and advance the goals of the climate action plan and to advance the sustainability of the goals of their city, their school itself.
Great. We have just a few more questions here, and I think we still have some time. Another question is, can you talk about an example where you received pushback from constituents, and how did you address that pushback to win that group over to supporting the plan?
It's an interesting question because there's always not only on this plan but on any plan that you create, there's always sort of there's always something that you left out or maybe you didn't emphasize strongly enough. There was a good balance in the task force that helped to create the climate action plan. So I think that helped mitigate any one particular challenge that would come to the climate action plan because you had sort of a balanced set of folks who were reviewing the plan itself. I think there was pushback on the aggressiveness of it. So are we being aggressive enough in what we're trying to achieve, in particular with something like renewable energy? And there was sort of a lot of renewable energy advocates, I think, who wanted to be more aggressive with that. The pushback that occurred, a lot of folks used the climate action plan to push back on things that the city was or wasn't doing. So there are two examples of that. One would be with the existing coal-fired power plants that are in Chicago, and the other would be with the rollout of residential recycling. There are still two power plants in Chicago that are powered by coal. And so a lot of folks would look to the climate action plan and say, well, this is part of the city's goals. When are you guys when is the city going to address this? And I think there was a lot of demand as the climate action plan was getting developed to call that out specifically as an action. And if you look within the plan, there is a general focus on moving towards a less carbon-intensive electric grid, but not a specific mention of those. There's a specific mention of it, but it's within a much larger context. The city just announced recently that they are actually going to shut down the coal plant, so it was a nice victory there, and it does align with the climate action plan. The second second was, for a long time, Chicago has been sort of inching ahead on rolling out residential recycling, so separate collection of recyclables from general refuse. And this was in the Climate Action Plan. It was called for, and folks would say, it's in your Climate Action Plan, when is this going to happen? Again, it's something that was announced now. It's going to be at the end of 2013, but it was, for a long time, it was something where it wasn't clear when it was going to happen, and people, ended up using the Climate Action Plan to say, well, this is part of your goals. You really need to be addressing it. So I would say more of the pushback that was experienced was about what was in the plan, and using what was in the plan to push back on the city to help get it accomplished. The other thing you can do, and I don't have the examples off the top of my head, but if you look, there was an initial set of here are the recommended actions for the Climate Action Plan, and again, this is in the report section of the website, and there's more than 26 actions that are recommended. And in the end, there are only 26 in the plan. So you could take a look there and get an idea recommended, but weren't actually adopted into the plan itself.
Great. This is a more general question, just in regard to the progress you've made to date. You talk about the 5 different strategy areas, and there was interest in knowing what's been the most successful strategy thus far.
Yeah, so let's go back to our scorecard here. There has been a really strong focus on energy efficiency, and as we look within the emissions inventory, one of the biggest drops, and this is no surprise because it's 70% of our emissions, has been because of what's happened in the buildings sector. It's hard, it gets tricky when you start measuring this in terms of what's the result of a specific program versus what's the result of the economy or weather or all these other changes. So that's a particular challenge when you're measuring. But the programs that have been initiated, there are measurements associated with those programs. And so you can look at a program level and see that there's actually been a lot of movement on energy efficiency. More to come, of course. It's certainly not where it needs to be yet. But as I compare them, I'd say that's been particularly successful because it's both, we've seen results and it's been a conscious effort and focus from the city and from others to help move that sector forward. I'd say within clean and renewable energy, Chicago opened the largest urban solar plant in the country, and that was a really great demonstration project for renewable energy, and that's contributed to some of the emissions reductions in addition to some of the purchases that I highlighted before. The other one that's been good in terms of its trending in the right direction is the transportation side. Public transit in Chicago has hit its highest level of ridership last year since 1991, and so this has helped sort of with the mode shift that we've been hoped for and sort of laid out in the Climate Action Plan. But I would say in terms of where you have an alignment of both results and a really focused effort, I would point to energy efficiency as being that particular one that stands out as having seen results on both of those areas.
Great. You were touching on some of the next couple questions, which have to do with green jobs. One person wanted to know a little bit more, in terms of what types of green jobs have been or are envisioned to be created associated with implementation of the plan. And another person was interested in kind of the net job gain associated with transitioning from past power sources such as your coal-fired power plants to current jobs, and kind of where the balance is now in terms of net job growth.
Good. It's been, and this is something that the external advisors and the other folks that comment on the Climate Action Plan consistently bring forward, which is what is the economic benefit of the plan? How are you spelling this out in terms of jobs and economic development? I will mention that for more detailed information, there is an economic development report that we did recently, which sort of laid out it wasn't specific to the Climate Action Plan, but it talked about green jobs and what is the potential for green jobs in Chicago. And again, this used the Brookings data to look at that. That potential really, let me just go to the slide here. Focused. So this doesn't break it down. The report breaks it down in terms of the different sectors. A lot of them were from energy efficiency. There's a pretty strong energy efficiency base of companies in Chicago. And we expect that, as energy efficiency moves forward, that these companies in this sector would grow. In addition, there's a lot of architects and sort of building engineers in Chicago as well, and so we would see that as a particular source of growth in the green jobs sector. You can see on the right-hand side, we call out something called an energy center of excellence. This is a call out to the fact that we think that sector in particular, energy efficiency and energy, is a place where we'll be seeing that green jobs growth. In terms of numbers, these are the 2010 number is the number from the Brookings study, so 25,000, and we think that's a conservative estimate based on what their definition is. And we think we have the potential to double the green jobs by 2020. Could you, in the bottom right-hand side, you can see, this is basically the increase in green job growth that we want to highlight, going from 1.9% as a percentage of all the jobs to between 3 and 3.8% in 2020. So that's where we really highlight, what we want to get to in terms of, or what we think is realistic and what we think we can get to by 2020. And could you repeat the second question for me?
Yes, the second question was, you talked about job gains. What were job losses, such as the coal plant, and what are the current net jobs and expected net jobs? So I think you were addressing that question to some extent in talking about the increases here so far, the net increases.
Right. So with moving to a low carbon economy, what changes do we expect in the job mix? That's a difficult question to address. Just because anytime you're talking about jobs, it's the question of what's going away and what's being created. I think that one of the more interesting pieces that was put forward, this is again done by an external group, by Metropolis Strategies, talked about the region's green economic opportunities. And for that, there were a lot of sectors that were identified as potential opportunities. For Chicago, the smart grid is a big investment that's coming over the next 10 years. There is an innovation fund associated with what's happening within smart grid to foster new companies and innovation. So we think that some of a number of the jobs are going to happen because of these energy innovations that are going to come from the smart grid investment and from other investments as well. In Chicago, we also have a lot of lighting companies. And so this green sector report highlighted the potential for some of these smaller lighting companies to help lead the way on energy-efficient lighting, and then there's ways in which the city can help develop that as a manufacturing base for sort of energy efficiency. In terms of job losses, that's one that's harder to estimate, and we haven't looked specifically at what some of the potential job losses might be. In terms of just the different intensity, I think the national studies are where I look to for what's the job intensity of a dollar spend in different sectors. And the job intensity of a dollar spend in energy efficiency is really high. So you get a lot of jobs per $1 million that you invest in energy efficiency, much more so than in the energy production side of it, which would be sort of the reference to the production of electricity.
Great. We're coming up on 1 o'clock here, but I believe Jill said that you'd be willing to stay on to answer a few extra questions.
Yeah, I think I have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. So those of you who want to stay on the line, we have several more questions here for Tom, and we'll try to get to a couple of them and then wrap up. The next question was that you mentioned urban heat island effect, and can you talk a little bit about whether the Clinton Foundation suggestion regarding white roofs has been considered in Chicago?
Yes. So, and there was also a white roofs initiative that I think the city signed on to as well. So yes, white roofs has been considered considered as an option. It is moving forward. Certainly, the city looks at either vegetated roofs or white roofs for all of its properties when it's going in and either building new or sort of going in and redoing the roof. I would have to. I'm not a specific expert on white roofs, so that may be information that I could get for you. There are also incentive programs for green buildings, and I believe white roofs are part of those incentive programs. There are also for developments that are receiving city funding. There are green roof requirements, and in some cases white roof requirements for some of those as well. So certainly. Green roofs and white roofs have been an emphasis here. I can't off the top of my head name the specific programs, but I can give you examples of some of them.
Great. The next question was, do you have evaluation measures in place for your adaptation strategy? And if so, how are you? If you can give an example or two of how you're evaluating your progress on adaptation.
I will let Olivia answer that one.
So the way that we're evaluating our adaptation progress right now is still, I would say, a working draft because it's such a tough thing to evaluate since you're looking at impacts that are also occurring over a potential range rather than a very explicit impact. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to look at adaptation over sort of 3 different categories, and we think about it as, one, looking at the climate impacts and as we traditionally sort of speak about impacts under projected impacts, looking at those and seeing how we can observe our climate impacts, and are the climate impacts that have been projected under our climate impacts analysis actually occurring in Chicago? Are we seeing more heavy precipitation during the spring and winter? Are we seeing more extreme heat days during the summer and happening at a more frequent basis? So those types of things. And then we're also monitoring sort of a second area that would be areas that we can take action to be prepared for potential impacts. So those would be the types of things probably Tom already mentioned, putting in green roofs to help manage stormwater and manage urban heat island effect and extreme heat in Chicago, or putting in pervious pavement throughout our city and our alleys to help manage stormwater, so those types of things. And then we're also trying to monitor what I would sort of call a climate-correlated impact. So it's an impact that would occur that you might be able to correlate to climate, although there are other factors there as well. So that would be something like a basement flooding, where you would say this is correlated to more extreme precipitation, but there's probably other factors at play here. So what we're trying to do right now, and why I speak about this as a work in draft, is that we're trying to be able to tie those things to one another and see how we might be able to measure that. So the train of thought would be, are we seeing the extreme precipitation? Are we seeing basement floodings happen in those same years? And are we also putting in sort of pervious pavement to try to mitigate that problem? And then perhaps we'll be able to tell a story about our progress from there. So that's sort of where that stands with our adaptation work in progress. A lot of cities don't really have a way right now to measure adaptation. So as we're speaking with other cities through the various networks that we're involved with, others are interested in this conversation and seem to be trying to pursue it in a similar direction. But there really isn't sort of a best practice established yet in terms of how to measure adaptation, because as I mentioned, it's such sort of a vague thing as you're looking at a range of potential impacts.
Great, thanks. I think that we're going to have to leave it there, and I'm going to be turning it back over to Jill, who has some housekeeping to wrap up the session for today. But thanks for taking the time to provide answers to all those great questions. We still have about a half dozen that are in the hopper, and Tom and Olivia, I believe, have agreed to answer those in writing. So if we didn't get to your question on the webinar today, you can expect a response via email, and I believe all the answers and discussion will be cataloged as well in the archives for this webinar. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jill.
Okay, thank you, Heather. I want to again thank Tom for his willingness to talk with us today about Chicago's Climate Action Plan. A really great discussion. Also, a thank you to Heather Elmer for moderating. A thank you to NOAA, the National Sea Grant College Program, Old Woman Creek Nair, and The Ohio State University for funding this webinar. I did want to remind you that our survey URL for this webinar is in the chat feature. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. We would like your input as we develop a regional climate site, so please take that time if you could. I also wanted to refer you to resources and the archive of previous webinar presentations, which are located on our changingclimate.osu.edu website. This webinar series is sponsored by the OSU Climate Change Outreach Team and will continue next month with a presentation by Dr. Eric Nisbet of The Ohio State University, who will be discussing strategies to use to communicate climate change. Thank you again to Tom McKone from the Civic Consulting Alliance and all participants on this webinar. We really hope that this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thank you and have a great afternoon.